All right, welcome back. I am gonna start working on this patch right here. I got a piece of metal that's gonna fit my size of the patch. Initially, I was gonna run up, get some new metal. This metal here is just too thick. It's 16 gauge, this is 18 gauge. So what I ended up doing was salvaging a piece of metal. If budgets are tight, you can do this, especially if you got a bunch of crap sitting around. I just salvaged it off of that car right there. Bam. So, cut it out of the quarter. It's a nice section right there. It's not rusty. It'll do what we need to do. So initially, what we're going to do is we're going to take this piece. We're going to get it all set up. It had an initial little curve to it. So we're just going to take our body hammer, kind of pound that curve out. Try to get it flat. You can do this on an anvil if you want. There we go. You got that little curve to the door out of it. Because even though this looks flat, there is a slight curve right here. Very minor. We can put that back in once we do it. But this gives me my section so I can see what we're going to do here. And then what we'll end up doing is, I'm not worried about all the paint, but you can see where I ground on each end. I just want to take a little grinder and I want to grind on each end of it right here. Just so I can clear off some of that nastiness, right? We need to do the same thing in here. And just get some of that scale that's off the inside off. You see those little rag lines? Little lines of sharded metal. We need to get that stuff off of there. So we have a nice clean edge to work with here. So we'll peel this back off. Got a little shard in there yet. Everything else feels pretty good. Oh, there's a little one right there. A couple here and there. And most of that's just from cutting. So you're just gonna have that. So now what we're gonna end up doing is we're gonna make this patch. You can see that this one's kind of bowed a little bit that direction, just for the simple sake that that was on the quarter panel. So, same situation. Try to keep everything flat. That's pretty close. We'll do what we need to do. A couple little pushes there, and we'll get it set up. So, now that we've got our metal all ready to go, we're going to try to line up our edges as best as we can. We'll get this set so it fits within this. I'll just use the original paint line right there. I'm going to make sure that this is sitting a little wider at the bottom, so I have to trim it out, okay? And then I'll grab my grease pen, which is over here. You can use anything. You can use a Sharpie, you can use a marker, you can scribe it. I just use Hobart's little grease pens. They work out pretty well. Now what I'll end up doing is I'm going to throw a clamp on this, and that clamp is going to help keep it flat up against the metal, even though that these things are basically pretty much flat the way they are. It'll get any sort of fun out of there, so we can make sure we have a nice flat surface to go to. I'm going to throw one more clamp right up there, and that should take care of it. We'll put a little C-clamp on it. Never fails, right? You open the drawer above what you need before you actually open the drawer you need. So, let me throw this on here real quick. Keep this tight. Kind of hard to do with one hand, but there we go. Now we're nice and tight. Have a nice little surface to run on. So I'm going to mark this just the way it needs to be. Come it down there. We'll come across here. We'll come up this line here, and then we'll come down. Oops. Come down right there. My grease pen kind of decided to have a whole bunch of grease come out. So we'll get this all scribed, and then we're going to work on cutting it out. Now you can use a tin snips. I'm not going to line this edge up on the bottom. I'll leave that a little wide, so that way I have some room to work with. But you can use the tin snips. Those tin snips right there would work just fine. The downside to doing this is once you start cutting, I'll show you, it starts to roll an edge. So these lines aren't going to be perfectly straight if you use a tin snips. A tin shear, excuse me, is a little better. It's one of those things you kind of have to have dedicated location for. But a cutoff wheel works just as well. If you're using a cutoff wheel, make sure you're going to the outside edge of this. That'll compensate for the width of the cutoff wheel itself, and that'll help you out. So last thing I'm going to do here, I'm going to move my clamp down, and I'm going to mark this section here so I have that hole ready to go. And that way I know where the bottom of this panel is when it comes to putting it on the car. That's one thing that you want to make sure you do. Usually what I'll end up doing is I'll mark the panel with an arrow down so I know what side goes down, or maybe right top on it, just so you know where you're supposed to be. Because the biggest thing that you can do is cut everything out, and then all of a sudden you don't know what side you were on, and then you're playing Jenga pieces trying to flip the thing over. Well, which direction was it here, you know? So that'll help. Once we're all done with this, the back side of this metal is really nice. It's actually coated with the original trunk coating, so we'll grind it all off. I don't see any reason why we're going to have a problem with it. We'll grind it all off, get it cleaned up. There shouldn't be any rust on it. Nothing like the piece that we cut off of there. So this will be a good patch. And it's also one of those situations where, like I said, it cuts down cost. Not saying that these panels are really expensive, but it's one of those things. They actually didn't even have any 18 gauge in stock. They had 16, 22, or 28 gauge. And 22 and 28, yeah, it would have worked. It's a little too thin, and I didn't want to create any issues with this while I'm welding it in. So I'm just going to go back to original width, and we should be good. So let me get this cut out. I'll be right back. All right. We got everything all ready to go here. I got it cut. I ended up using the tin snips just so I can get kind of the quickest and fastest way for you guys is going to be a tin snips or, like I said, a cutoff wheel. Either way works just fine. So when you use a tin snips, it rolls one of the edges down. Just lay it down flat on the ground, hammer around the outside edges here again, and get it all flat. So I already ground my hole back into it. I just use a little die grinder. And then what you need to do is you need to start in a corner. You need to start in a corner. Everything's all good. As you can see, this edge is not necessarily straight. It's kind of rounded. So I kind of rounded that edge a little bit. It's not looking too bad right there. But one thing that we do need to take care of is the upper portion is kind of rounded at the top here too. So what we'll do is we'll push this down. And if I push this up against, let's say, this edge here, you can see that it's pretty close on the edge, but it's a little short. So what we're going to do is we're going to push that down to the point where it matches up pretty darn good, and we're still wider than the rest of the panel. So what I'll end up doing is I'll start grinding with my grinder right at the very bottom edge here. We'll grind that out and we'll get it ready to go, and we'll just kind of start grinding this edge and making it so it's more flat rather than curved like this. So once this edge fits, I'll get back with you. We'll see where we're at here. We'll see what we could do, and I'm just going to keep grinding it and test fitting it, see where it's at. It's going to be pretty close. It's going to take a little bit of time, but it'll get there, trust me. All right, doing a little grinding here. Everything's starting to fit up pretty decently. We got the bottom fit really nice and tight. Top's fit nice and tight, but you can see where this panel is actually curved just enough that it won't do that. So we need to put a slight curve right in the center section. Easiest way to do that is grab a board, grab anything that you got, edge of the table, whatever you have, and just throw that down, lay it down on there, give it a little push on each end, kind of shape the thing where you want it to be. Now once you get to the edges and stuff, probably going to have to use a hammer a little bit just to get it in there, but that's starting to do what we want it to. So we'll test fit it again. It's just a lot of back and forth, you know, checking to see where everything fits. The tighter you make it, the better it's going to be, the easier it's going to be to weld. I think I'm happy with that, aside from this top corner where you can see it's kind of sitting out. So I need to grind this back just a little bit more on the edge. When you start grinding this stuff down, you're gonna get this scale on the outside edge. That's the scale that I'm talking about, that you wanna hit that with a grinder while you're fitting the thing in there. Because if this scale is on there and it's just preventing it from sitting inside that channel, you're gonna fight it and it won't fit in there right. But let's see what we got. My little hole pretty much lined up right where it needs to be. It might be a little wider towards the left of the car, but that doesn't really matter. Like I said, it's just more of along the lines of making sure that there's a hole there for that screw to come through from the backside. So let me grind this down a little bit more. We'll try to get that closer. Let's see where we're at as far as this goes. So we're pretty darn close. I mean, that's the width of the cutoff wheel on the top and stuff. So I got another 1/4 inch to go yet. Grind that down. I'll just grind it down almost to this line. That's why I like to leave these grease pen marks on there. You can kind of see where it's at, grind it down to the line, get it close, but don't go all the way, and then just kind of test fit it again. Keep going back and forth. Be right back. All right. We are good to go. This patch is all ready. Got one little spot. Oh, no, we don't need to even worry about that. This patch is all ready. One thing that I thought about after I was talking to you a few minutes ago about getting the contour right. One thing you can do, take the patch and lay it next to what you're working on. When you see that that thing matches good, I mean, it's gonna be welded in there. When you see that thing matches good, you're pretty much right there. You know, you don't have to worry about that contour any much. And it's not that much. It's very minor. It's just a slight curve as it goes in there. Now I did have to trim this corner out a little bit on the inside portion of this panel, and it's just because the cutoff wheel, I didn't want to dig too deep into this backing the backing plate or the shell of the door. So there was a little excess metal in there, but we are basically fit like a jigsaw puzzle. Everything's nice and tight. There is a little bit of a gap up here, not the end of the world. This stuff is feeling a little low, but we're gonna take care of that as we start going. One of the things that we'll end up doing, I can't even get it out of there now. One of the things we'll end up doing is we'll get a pry bar and we'll go from the inside and we'll kind of keep that up. We gotta try to weld this all in level with the panel. If you don't weld it in level with the panel, you're gonna end up creating yourself more body work, which always is a concern. So the leveler you make this as you go by lifting the edges up before you weld it, the easier this thing's gonna be and the nicer it'll be in the long run for you doing body work. Not saying you can't just throw this in here and goob it all up and fill over the top of it. You absolutely can. But when I do this, I like to take my time, make sure that everything lines up and keep it nice and flat. One thing is, once the metal is low, you can't bring it up, especially around the weld zone. So as I start distributing heat across this, what's gonna end up happening is that heat is gonna transfer down and it's gonna take that metal and start to distort it. It may shrink in, it may come out a little bit, but if this metal is already below where it needs to be, now it's gonna take this metal that's supposed to be just the same height and it's gonna bring it down there too. So you're always adjusting that metal, this metal, you're adjusting it all up so it's all level while you're welding it in there. So that's one thing. Right now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna prep the outside edge, get this all ready to go. I'm gonna prep the backside and I'm gonna spray a weld through primer on the backside. 3M makes a weld through primer. There's many different kinds. There's copper styles. There's a whole bunch of different things that you can use on it. So what we're gonna end up using is I don't even know where the stuff is. What we'll end up using is the 3M stuff. But while I'm in here and looking at this, you can use this cavity wax too. It's 08852. It's basically just a paraffin wax. When you're all said and done, they make different little nozzle tips for this that you can plug in there, different hose sizes. Really long ones, really short ones. And then when you're all said and done, rust proofing is an important thing. Go inside here, coat the inside of this just at the end. This car isn't going to see the rain that much. However, that wax, the wax coating, will prevent any moisture from penetrating any of the open exposed spots that you have in here. So that's one thing that you'll do. I'll end up spraying a 3M weld through primer on there. Basically, we need to keep the weld zone clear. So just before I go to weld it in, I'm gonna grind this little edge. Everything will be good. And then when I'm all said and done and finished welding, I'll prep everything on the outside, and then I'll come back in with that cavity wax and or some POR 15. I'm not going to get POR 15 up in here. There's just not enough room to get it. I'll probably only really get it in this section here that I can actually reach. So this spot up in here, we'll just hose the cavity wax in there with the wand, let it run down, and it'll run down into the bottom channel here. It'll go around all this edge, and it'll coat down in the corner where the door shell and the skin meet. So it'll be good for it in the long run. Very last thing I'll do after I get it all put back together and painted, I'll run a channel down here and just spray some of that paraffin wax right at the bottom. You do want to make sure that those holes are blown out when it's all said and done. Give it about 24 hours. That stuff doesn't really ever dry. It just stays kind of tacky. If you touch it after a few years, it may seem dry to the touch, but as soon as you push into it, it's going to smear into your finger. That's what it's supposed to do. So it's designed to do that. But let me prep this all up. We'll get this thing ready to go, and I'll show you how to set up the welder. All right, we are ready to roll. We got this clamped in. I'm going to show you kind of what we came up with on the backside. That's kind of what it looks like on the backside. I cleaned the outside perimeter. Now, don't get me wrong, it's weld through primer. You'd think you could weld right through it. If you try to weld through it in a patch like this where it's a lap weld, you're butting it right up against the outside perimeter, you're going to end up having spatter coming back. The welds are going to be a little dirty because it does have to burn through that. Generally, you're not supposed to weld through the weld through primer. You're supposed to keep that clean, keeping everything else as coated as possible without disturbing anything. So once I get this in here, I don't know if I'll be able to do it with one hand again, but I need to set this in and get it clamped just like I had it clamped before. Let me see if I can get it. Throw a clamp on it. That should be it. Now you see it's a little low here, a little high here. What we're going to end up doing is doing a tack weld, making sure that it's nice and flush right here probably, where there's no high spots, there's no low spots, nothing like that. We'll make sure it's nice and flush, and we'll tack it right there. Generally, you'll want to tack it in 4 places so you can kind of start adjusting the tip of this. Don't move the outside metal that you're patching to, because this is where we want it to stay. Once we have this welded, it's going to be hard, and it's not going to move too easily. So we want to keep this as flush as we can with the original panel. If it gets a little lower, it's not the end of the world. We just don't want it to go sinking in because this is way too low, like down in here, and then, oh, I'll just beat this edge in to try to get it to match up. That's fine, but you're going to have this much mud in it when you're all said and done. Now, if we can get from the backside, which we can, we'll get a hammer on the backside and we'll push it up. We'll put a little tack weld in there. We're going to blow dry with an air blower all the welds as we go, so they're touchable with your fingers, with your bare hand. Then we know that our heat distribution isn't going to be too much. It's very minimal. The more heat, if you just start welding on this thing to the bottom, this is going to be glowing hot. You could fry an egg on that. And what's going to happen to that metal is it's just going to sink down in, and it's going to go down into that channel because you just created a bunch of heat. So we don't want that. We want to do a tack weld, then we want to do a tack weld, and a tack weld, and just kind of move it around, and then dry those areas, blow them, cool them off with your blower, and then once it's kind of to the point where you can touch it, move on to the next. And we're just going to stitch weld each one of those welds together. Now, I got the gas set up here. We're ready to go. The welder is turned on. I grabbed a piece of the metal that I already cut out, because this is what we're welding to. This is basically the same metal that's in that door, and cleaned up both sides, because that's what we're welding to as well. We got nice clean metal. And then we're going to take this. Our gas is going to be set. I have my gas set currently at right around 25 psi. And we're going to go ahead and get our welder out. Double check your tip. Make sure your tip is pretty clean. Mine's a little dirty there, but we're going to test the welder and see how it's set up first. Basically what you want to hear is you want to hear bacon frying. If you don't hear the sound of bacon frying, then you've got some issues. There's only 2 settings that you have. You have your wire speed, which is how quickly your wire comes out, and your metal thickness. I know, for a fact, we are in 18 gauge. So I'm gonna start at the bare minimum there. I've got up to right around 5.5 that I can go to. I can turn it up to 6 if I really want, but we'll start with that, and we'll start with 40 for our wire speed. That's kind of a general setting in general for this, just for starting out. And we'll just do a quick little tack. See how it sounds nice and tight like bacon? We got a nice weld. We got good penetration on the back side. I'm gonna roll with that. I'm not gonna mess around with it too much more. I could turn the heat down a little bit, and by turning the heat down, you're turning your voltage down. Your wire speed, it can get adjusted a smidge as well if you really wanted to, but honestly, I'm really happy with that. You can see how it kind of started pulsating there. Still a good weld, but I'm gonna say my wire speed needs to go back up just a smidge more. Oh yeah, that's where it's at. There we go. We got plenty of penetration, nice good weld on the backside. We're ready to roll, okay? Key to this is make sure that you got a good ground. If you don't have a good ground on your metal, there's no point in trying to weld. If you're grounding to rust, there's no point in trying to weld. What I like to do, grind it, or actually flip it over here and use it right where we're trying to weld. So we're gonna weld right there, and what I'll end up doing is I'll take a little hammer and I'll push down on this just a smidge, and we'll weld right between that hammer mark and that ground. So I can't do that with 2 hands, but I will be right back. All right, got a couple little welds here. They're just tacked into place. Now this one did burn through just a smidge, but while you're doing this, you wanna make sure your metal's kind of straight, up and down. Always adjusting things so there's no hang up or anything that's sitting up higher than it needs to be. And then take your welding wire right in the middle there, right in the center of that, I don't know if you can see it there, right in the center of that line, okay? Let me zoom out just a smidge. Right in the center of that line, nice little tack weld. That's all you need. It doesn't need to be crazy. It doesn't need to be anything like that. The next one we'll do right below that, and we'll push it into the first one, okay? But I'm gonna start tacking up over here and getting some of this stuff set, because you can see, remember how this one was down so far? Just by adding a little heat over here, that thing already twisted, and now it's really high up at the top. So I wanna get over here next and get this set. I may have to grind just a smidge. I'm probably gonna do a tack weld right here to make sure that I'm not gonna be too high right here. It looks like there's a little bump right here in the metal on the inside, or on the top side of this, and it may not fit perfectly in there, but it did fit before, so I'm not too worried about it. One thing I am gonna do is I'm gonna clean up a little spot up here so I can ground it right to the vehicle, and then I'm gonna clean up just a small spot underneath so I have 2 good grounding spots for this ground clamp, because it is getting a little bit of spatter here and there, and that's why this little tiny hole started to develop. So we don't want that. We want nice, clean welds. All right, so we got a few tack welds on here. We're welding along. Now you may notice, I'll show you here if I can find my other weld. So on this one, I cleaned both sides. You see how nice and clean the welds are? Everything's all nice. So on this one, I got that POR on the backside. You can see how they're not quite as clean. So that's basically what you're doing. You're melting that metal into it, and it's burning off that coating. So that's one thing that you want to watch out for. It's not going to hurt this situation. This metal's thick enough. Again, this is not going on a car that's going into the salt. It's not going into the water. Once I coat the backside of this, everything will be coated. Nothing's going to end up creating a rust spot in this area again. One thing that you do want to make sure, though, is that you're holding the welder down long enough that you're getting good penetration on the backside. Now, if you're not, that can create a problem for you. So we'll do a weld right there real quick, just so you can kind of see what's happening with it. Nice and easy. We'll do one more right next to it. And blew out just a smidge, however, it will be okay. Do one right up here. And then what I always end up doing, oh, I dropped it on the floor, that's why. nice and cool. Okay? Once you know that you can touch those with your hand without burning yourself, you know that everything's good. It's still a little hot right in this area. As cool as possible. So I'm going to weld this in, get it all stitched up all the way around. This side's got a little bit of an edge here, it needs to be brought up. This side too. This is good, this is good, that's good, that's good. All this is good. It's just this edge needs to be brought up just a smidge as I start to weld it, and we should be good to go. I'll start prepping it here, I'll get some of it prepped, and then I'll stop on the rest and kind of show you what I'm doing. All right. So we're moving right along. Everything's going good. It started to kind of dip down here just a little bit right at the edge. So what I ended up doing was taking my Unispot welder, stud gun, welded a little stud on it, right at an edge where I already welded. And then I grabbed my little shoot suit and I locked it onto place here, pulled it up. You basically just, it's like a rivet gun. It pulls on the stud and it brings that metal back up. You can fix dents with that, you can do different things. Now I locked it into place, and I already did this. I got underneath with my hammer and I beat the edge up here, so now that it's nice and flush. Now I can weld this edge, I can weld this edge, and then once I'm all said and done, I just take that little thing, little stud, take a side cutters, grab it at the base, twist it, and it'll bust right off. So, one of those things, little cheater in there. Everything's starting to go. I got the bottom all welded up nice. Now one thing you'll remember, some of those little pinholes that it made in here. You can see them here. Keep in mind, this is that double-edged area. This is laying right on top of rusty metal that's on the back. Now that metal has been coated with POR, so it's trying to burn through all that stuff, rust and all, which ends up burning in, melting, and then it burns a hole back through. So those little pinholes, stuff like that, just need to be filled back in. Just a quick little tack, just like these, they'll grind down. So I started grinding on these with my belt sander. I just got a Harbor Freight 1/2 inch wide belt sander. Works really well on welds like this. You don't want to, obviously you can see where it started grinding on the edge. You want to stay right on top of the weld as much as you can. Now the reason for this is you make this edge too thin over here, what's going to happen is once you start grinding all this, you'll grind it all down and it'll be flat and ground completely smooth across here. But one side of that is going to be slightly thinner than the other. That's another reason I didn't want to use that 16 gauge steel, is because I would have had to grind that all back down to 18 gauge right in this area, and it would have just been a pain in the butt. So using the correct steel and making sure that I'm staying grinding on the welds themselves as I'm grinding them is going to help me to prevent issues from this edge or this edge becoming too thin. Because I may end up taking a stud and I may end up welding it right here. Well, if this side's already been ground on and it's really thin, I may burn a hole right through that, welding that stud on. I may do a little bit of body filler or body work right here and try to move this metal up a smidge. And what will end up happening is it'll crack the metal that's thin. So that's what we're trying to avoid here, and that's what we want to make sure that we take into consideration as we're prepping this once we get around to it. I'm going to keep stitching this stuff back up. I'll probably start grinding this one too, just so I can kind of see where I need to end up welding here. These are really turning out nice, and everything's going around really well. All right, we are all said and done with this thing. I ended up grinding around the outside perimeter, taking care of all the little welds all the way around it. I do have a couple little pinholes here that I need to fill in. I'm not really worried about them. They're really minimal, and it's not the end of the world. So what I'm going to end up doing is doing body work to this next, getting everything taken care of. As I was welding this in, a low spot started to form right up here. The metal had to go somewhere. There was nowhere else for it to basically go, so it started to kind of concave in. So I cooled that down, let it go, and then I finished up welding down here. As I was welding it, I kind of made sure that I was grinding things. One thing you are going to want to watch out for grinding is don't overheat the metal with the grinder as well. You can do just as much damage overheating it with the grinder as you can with just welding it. So you want to make sure that you're grinding a little bit, kind of moving around, letting it cool. Take a feel of it. If it feels like it's starting to get hot, you're going to want to stop, cool it down, come back to it. Now, one thing I was going to tell you is do not get the belts that come with those Harbor Freight ones. Get these belts here. They're 60 grit, 33445. They're purple. They last forever. As long as you do not put a bunch of pressure on them, those belts have a little seam where they're glued together, and that seam will actually bust and rip loose. So this is feeling pretty good. It's a little close. It needs a little more work right in there, right where it's sitting. It's a 1/4 inch. I'm not really even worried about it, but I will put a couple more studs on here and pull this back out once I start cleaning up the areas that need it on the outside of this skin. The outside portion of this is not too bad either. It's actually fairly tight. It's just a matter of getting everything in this center section up just a smidge more. And if you remember, that brace is kind of inside here where this door shell is sitting. I can't really get anything in there, but I can put a couple studs on the backside and pull it back through. Once this is done, I'll block it all, get it all set up, metal finished, get a hammer on the backside, get it finished with the dolly. We'll kind of go over that stuff as well, what you're going to need to know, what you're going to need to do. Hammer and dolly stuff can be kind of specific. I got a whole drawer full of things that we can use, and we'll really see what we're going to need in this. I don't want a lot of filler in this, obviously, and I don't want to use any fiberglass. Everything's going to be basically a skim coat. People always tell me, "Oh, I don't want any Bondo. I don't want any filler in my car." Regardless of the situation, your car's going to have some sort of filler in it. It has to be straight. Unless you have all brand new panels that have absolutely no dents in them, you're not going to get away from doing that. So regardless of the situation, there is going to be a skim coat of filler on this. Majority of the panel probably won't have anything in it. There's just a few little dings and dents and a couple little spots. I could see one right on the other end right there. That's a little low spot. But that stuff will even dolly out and hammer out with some straight up metal work. So we're going to get into this. We'll do some metal work on this little section. And then I think the next video I'll probably make is doing a door skin on this little guy. So that'll be a fun one for you guys to learn and listen on that. It's fairly simple. It's not as hard as you think. And it's pretty fun. So this didn't take me too long. I want to say like 3-4 hours total I had invested into it. 3-4 hours the day before. So you're probably looking at, 6 hours total to patch this little guy. Now, had I put a door skin on this, I did find one. Had I put a door skin on it, it would probably be about 3 hours total. So it's a little less, but this little patch, nothing compared to putting a door skin on. And then I want to make sure that these things are staying in line. So this is kind of my guide for the rear quarter panel. So hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you got any other questions, hit the comments, let me know. I'll be more than glad to answer them. I got part numbers and all sorts of stuff for you if you need it. I know some people are kind of specific on that thing. So let me know. Thanks for watching.